Hey there tonight. We're stepping into a world that looks a lot like our own but colder, hungrier, and far more afraid. Most people today have heard of the Salem Witch Trials. Maybe you remember a few names, a few dates, or just word witch, but beneath the legend lies something much darker and much more human. What happened here wasn't about magic, it was about fear, and what fear does when it's given power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake at Fiend, tell me where you're listening from, your town, your time, anything you'd like to leave behind. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to the year of 1692. The 17th century is nearing its end, but for the people of New England, time moves like frozen sap, slow, bitter, and full of silence. This is the age where plagues still walk without names, where God is always watching, and where the devil is more than a metaphor. He's a neighbor, a shadow, a whisper at your daughter's bedside. You are in Salem Village, Massachusetts, a small tight number. The crosses and wolves howl louder than prayers. You wouldn't call Salem a village of peace. It was never meant to be a soft place. Life here was sharp by design, cut from cold soil and harder scripture. Puritans who settled this land decades before did so with the firm belief that comfort led to corruption, and the hardship, when accepted with humility, was the surest path to God. So you worked and you prayed and you bade, and if something hurt, that was the point. Most homes in Salem were plain wooden, narrow and full of children, chores, worry, and the weight of judgment. Gods and your neighbors, no curtains, no singing, no dancing. Silence was safer, and work was next to holiness. The people here were not cruel by nature, but they were cautious, trained to believe that the world beyond their fences was full of snares. There were devils in the forest, temptations enthroned, and inside each man and woman a battle raged between grace and sin. Every thought mattered, every shadow held meaning. Land disputes festered, family grudges hardened like ice corals over church seating became lifelong rifts, and all of it simmered beneath a veneer of godliness until something gave it permission to rise. Salem was not one town but two. Salem town near the harbor was larger, wealthier, more connected to the outside world. Salem Village, where theatricals would take place, was smaller, poorer, and spiritually stricter. And resentment burned quietly between them, over money, over ministers, over who carried more of God's favor. Reverend Samuel Parris, the man at the center of it all, had been hired only a few years before. He was not loved. Some saw him as proud, petty, too demanding. He wanted land, firewood, respect, and his sermons rarely soothed. He spoke of sin with fury, of hell with detail, and off witches with frequency. When his daughter and niece became afflicted, few felt sorry, but many felt justified, because for years Salem had been waiting for something to break. The winter had not helped. Bitter cold stretched through January and February like a second plague. Crops had failed the year before. Food was low. Illness lingered in the lungs of the elderly. And always, just beyond Fetrine, the wilderness waited, dark, endless, untamed. It was the devil's territory, they believed, and maybe, just maybe, he had decided to cross over. You may not realize how close these people lived to collapse. Not just physically but spiritually. One failed harvest from hunger, one argument from exile, one question from Hysteria. Then came the children. The girls' fits were frightening. Yes, but they were also oddly familiar. The Bible spoke of possession, of torment, of God allowing Satan to test the faithful through trials. These weren't meaningless spasms. They were a sign the devil was among them, and Simeon had let him in. But who? That question was not asked with curiosity. It was asked with desperation, because once evil is loose, you don't want understanding, you want someone to blame. And in Salem there were plenty of people waiting to be blamed: the poor, the sick, the odd, the defiant, women who didn't behave, the men who didn't bow, the families who kept to themselves, the ones whose children died in infancy, the ones whose bread never rose, the ones whose eyes lingered too long in a village like this. To be strange was to be dangerous. So the town watched, waited, whispered, and when the afflicted girls finally began to speak, to name names, their relief was almost as great as the horror. At last they had an answer. Or so they thought. You might wonder why so many believed. Why grown men would listen to the words of trembling children and sentence neighbors to death. But you must remember, in 1692, children were not vessels of innocence. They were weak, corruptible, prone to temptation. If they cried out, it meant something. Either that they were under attack or under the devil's control, and no one wanted to be wrong about which, so people began to distance themselves from certain neighbors, from old friends, from long-held doubts, because when the air grows cold with suspicion, safety isn't found in truth, it's found in conformity. You show up to church, you recite the right verses, you keep your head down, and if a question rises in your throat, you swallow it. Better to stay unnoticed than to be the next one noticed too much. And through it all, the girls kept screaming. By March, the village was no longer debating whether witches were real. The year has arrived colder than any. In memory, fires struggle to warm the corners of homes built too thin against the wind-grain stores. Run low, livestock wither, disease lingers like smoke. And then one January morning, in the home of Reverend Samuel Paris, something stranger than famine or frost begins. Toster. The house was quiet when it began. At first, there were no screams, no outbursts. Just a child staring too long at the wall. Her name was Betty Paris, 9 years old, daughter of the Reverend. She wasn't ill, not exactly. She still ate, still walked. But she spoke less, slept poorly, and flinched at shadows no one else could see then. One morning she began to scream. It wasn't the kind of scream a parent learns to ignore. This was shrill, uncontrolled, as if something had cracked open inside her. She flailed, she rolled onto the floor, her arms twisted behind her back in impossible ways. Her eyes lost focus when they returned. She whispered words that didn't belong to a child. The servants were terrified. Their reverend called for prayer. The mother wept. They thought it might pass, but then Abigail began. Abigail Williams, Betty's cousin, 11 years old, living in the same house. She began to mimic the same spasms, clawing at invisible things, shrieking at figures only she could see. At times she would leap up from her chair and strike at the air, claiming to be attacked. Other times she'd freeze mid-sentence, her body stiff, her gaze hollow. And that's when fear truly took hold, because it wasn't just one child anymore. More girls began to show these signs. Ann Putnam, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott. They didn't all live in the same house. They weren't always together, but her symptoms echoed one another: twitching, crying, howling, and most of all, accusing, pointing, describing visions of ghostly figures, dark beasts, women with cold hands and glowing eyes who came to them in dreams and wouldn't leave. No one could explain it, not the mothers, not the ministers, not the neighbors. So they brought in the doctor. His name was William Griggs. He had no potions for what he found, nowans to treat no illness, to name. The bodies were not feverish, their hearts were strong, their skin showed no marks until the girls said there were some, and then bruises were found, small, faint, but enough. After some time watching the contortions, hearing the cries, he offered his professional opinion. They were, in his words, under Annabelle hand. That phrase moved through Salem like thunder through Brittlewood. People began to murmur it at wells, at fire pits, in whispers, behind half-shuttered doors, not because it was new, but because it confirmed what they feared. This wasn't a fever, it wasn't childish fancy, it was a spiritual attack. And if the devil was in these girls, someone had let him in. The Reverend Paris doubled his prayers, he fasted, pleaded, he scoured his household for hidden sin. Even asked Titaba, the enslaved woman in his home, if she'd spoken to the girls about charms, about spells. She denied it. But he watched her closely. After that, people came to the house, now not to comfort, but to witness. The afflicted girls had become something like prophets, something like warnings. They would fall into fits and scream that someone was stabbing them with invisible needles. They would gasp and shout names, sometimes unfinished, sometimes whispered. It became a kind of theater, but no one was laughing. The girls claimed to see birds that weren't there, ghosts in the fireplace, figures with hooves instead of feet. One of them said a woman in the village had ridden through her window on a broom. Another said she had been bitten by a wolf with human eyes. And the adults listened, because what else could they do? This wasn't behavior anyone knew how to confront, not in a village where everything unexplained was either divine or demonic, not in a world where women were told to be. Silent children were told to be still, and any deviation from that order felt like rebellion, or worse, a corruption. At first the girls were believed simply because they were afflicted, but now people were starting to believe them because it was safer than doubting them, and the girls could feel it. Their voices grew bolder, their fits more intense. They began to describe their attackers in more detail, hands, hair, cloaks, voices, and people started to guess who they meant. That guessing wouldn't last long. Soon, the girls would give names, and when they did, the village would stop being afraid of ghosts and start being afraid of each other. It began with cries in the night, then it became fits, visions, and whispers, but now it speaks. At first, the afflicted girls only described shadow shapes, a claw in the dark, a cold hand on the throat. They spoke in riddles and nightmares. But soon the language changed. The accusation chirped, no longer ghosts without names now. They began to say ho. It started with Tituba, perhaps because she was close, perhaps because she was different, or perhaps because someone needed to go first. Girls said she came to them in dreams, that she pinched their skin while invisible, that she brought birds with red eyes and spoke in strange tongues, that she laughed while they screamed. Tituba denied it, but denial meant nothing anymore. She was enslaved, foreign and silent. When people wanted noise, that was enough. Then came Sarah Good, a poor pregnant beggar. She wandered at the village barefoot, muttering curses when turned away. Her face was gaunt, her eyes too intense. A child once grew sick after refusing her a crust of bread. That story returned, reshaped as evidence. The girl said she sent spirits to choke Theman. The Dark One said she saw her riding a stick through the sky. And then Sarah Osborne, sickly, withdrawn, rarely attended church, had married beneath her station in Salem. That was a kind of sin. The girls said they saw her beside Tituba in fair visions, urging her to sign the devil's book. That was all it took. 3 women, 3 easy targets. Poor isolated female, wrong in the right ways. On February 29, 1692, they were arrested, brought to trial, not with evidence, but with belief, with the screams of children, with fevered stories, and the villagers came to watch, not for justice, but for confirmation. You might expect fear to settle after arrests are made, but that's not how contagion works. Beckhouse. The moment someone is named and taken, the others begin to wonder, who else ho next? And the afflicted girls feel this too. Their pain becomes theater. Their claims grow more vivid. They scream when someone enters a room. They cry out in court. They faint when someone passes them in the street. And every outburst creates a ripple. Another name, another knock at another door. It moves faster than the wind in houses built of timber. And tension, suspicion becomes gospel. A woman scolds her child, and the next day the girl collapses in fits. A man refuses to loan firewood, and the next night a girl dreams he stood over her bed whispering in Latin. No proof is needed, just a name, just a story, and the girls always seem to know what name to say. Soon there are more than 3, then 10, then 20. Warrants are issued, chains are readied. The jails begin to fill with people who had no idea yesterday that they would be prisoners today. And in every case the pattern holds. The afflicted accuse, the town believes, the accused deny, and their denial is taken as further proof. The justice system isn't built for truth, now it's built for purification. People begin to lie to survive. They confess to witchcraft they never practiced. They say they flew through the night sky, that they saw others dancing with the devil. They beg for mercy, and mercy sometimes is granted, which only proves, at least to the court, that their stories were true. Meanwhile, those who remain silent, who hold on to truth, are considered stubborn, proud, dangerous. If you insist on your innocence too loudly, too long, they will say the devil has hardened your heart. So the town holds its breath. People stop speaking at all, unless they must. Neighbors no longer make eye contact. The church pews grow quieter, heavier. When someone coughs, 5 heads turn. The girls scream louder. Even those who still harbor doubt no longer say so, because doubt itself is suspicious. If you question the truth of the afflicted, then maybe you too are in league with what haunts them, and what haunts them is growing more detailed by the day. You might think this is madness, you might call it mass hysteria, but to those inside it, it feels like clarity. A purification or reckoning long overdue after all the devil does in tenants. Himself he slips in through cracks, through strange women, bitter men, broken children, and if people are suffering, someone must be to blame, and that someone might live right next. To you on the morning of February 29th, 1692, the cold in Salem felt sharper than usual, not simply because of the frost clinging to windowsills or the wind gnawing at the edges of cloaks, but because something intangible had shifted what had begun. As rumor turned into testimony, and testimony to hysteria, now hardened into law on that day, the machinery of the courts began its work. Arrest warrants written in careful script and sealed with authority were handed down for the first 3 women ever accused in the Salem witchcraft outrage, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Each arrest unfolded in a way that reinforced what the town already believed. Sarah Good was apprehended near her makeshift shelter, bundled in filthy rags, her face hollowed by hunger and pregnancy. She offered little resistance, though her mouth remained sharp, unleashing curses and denials as thick constables bound her wrists. Mothers pulled their children away, whispering prayers under their breath as she was dragged down the road. No one stepped forward to intervene. Not even her husband. Sarah Osborne was arrested in bed, sickly and frail. She had barely left their home for months. She was too weak to stand and had to be helped onto a cart for transport. And yet, even in this vulnerable state, she was seen not as a victim of illness, but as a woman who had allowed Satan to weaken her spirit. Her absence from church, her unresolved lawfare, and her unconventional marriage were all interpreted as moral decay, proof that she had long since abandoned God's protection. Tituba, still residing in the Paris household, was the last to be taken. She said little as she was led away. Perhaps she already knew what Salem had decided about her long before her name was ever spoken aloud. As a woman of color, an enslaved servant and storyteller of strange tales and foreign spirits, Tituba had always been a silent figure in the background of Salem's life, present, but never accepted. Now she was no longer invisible. She was the face of a nightmare. What the records rarely say plainly is this: Tituba's confession did not come freely before she admitted to speaking with the devil or signing his book. She was beaten by her Master Reverend Samuel Paris. His blows were not to extract truth, but to force a sorry one that matched the fear already swirling through the village under pain and pressure. She gave them what they wanted: witches' spirits, a black dog, and a book no one else could see. And once the words left her mouth, there was no taking them back. Her punishment had transformed into prophecy. The 3 women were brought not to a prison immediately, but to Ingersoll's tavern, which had been temporarily repurposed as an interrogation chamber. In this makeshift courtroom, the afflicted girls were gathered. Their behavior, as expected, grew more extreme upon the sight of thickest. They shrieked when Sarah Good entered the room. They writhed and gasped when Osborne tried to explain herself, and Tituba so much as blinked. One girl fainted. In a world where survival depended on confession, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne chose silence or worse, resistance. They stood before the court under the gaze of magistrates and ministers and refused to say whatever Yanni wanted to hear. In Salem, where the concept of innocence had already been warped into an accusation of pride of the ear, denials were not interpreted as virtue. They were seen as streets. Neither woman confessed, neither bowed her head in shame, neither muttered lies that would have granted them a stay of execution. And in return, the courts offered them only one thing: Thegalau's Sarah Good, the poorest among them, was already a figure of scorn. Long before her arrest, she had no home, no wealth, no reputation worth defending, and as she stood in court, gaunt and heavily pregnant, she carried the weight not only of her own survival, but of her unborn child's as well. Her hands were shackled, but her voice was not, and she used it to lash out at her accusers with bitter clarity. She called the girls liars. She cursed the court. She declared that she had no dealings with Satan, and accused the entire proceeding of being a farce. None of it helped her. In fact, it sealed her fate to the magistrates. Her rage and bitterness were not the reactions of a wronged woman. They were evidence of her pact with the devil. Her refusal to confess was taken as proof that the devil had hardened Her heart, her poverty, her rough tongue, her isolation, each waste-twisted into confirmation that she had always been something other, something dangerous. Her own husband, when called to testify, turned against her. He admitted, suspecting her of witchcraft, and his betrayal, whether born of fear or frustration, stripped her of the last fragile layer of protection. But perhaps the cruelest blow came not from husband or judge, but from her child. Dorothy, good Sarah's 4-year-old daughter, had been taken from her mother's arms and imprisoned in a separate cell, interrogated alone by adults who needed proof and would accept it in any form. Dorothy was confused, frightened, and desperate to go home. When asked whether her mother had witches as friends, she mumbled yes. When pressed about what she had seen, she said she'd witnessed her mother talking to a stranger creature. Her words were vague, childish, inconsistent, but they were all the court needed. That testimony, extracted from a terrified toddler, was recorded and read aloud as part of Sarah Good's conviction. And then, in the late days of July, Sarah gave birth in the filth of the prison floor. The child did not survive. There were no doctors, no midwives, no prayer circles. There was no comfort, only a woman bound in iron, bringing life into a world that had already decided she was no longer fit to live. Shortly afterward, she was led to the gallows. The sun was hot, the crowd large. She walked the dirt path alone, passing neighbors who once ignored her and now watched her die. When asked at the scaffold if she would confess, if she would save her soul in her final moments, she lifted her head and spoke clearly, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." It was not forgiveness, it was not surrender. It was a curse, a prophecy, a final refusal to let the court define her story. They hanged her anyway. As for Sarah Osborne, her resistance took a quieter form. She was too ill to stand, too weak to shout. Her denial came through rasping breath, trembling hands, and the refusal to give the court the narrative it demanded. She insisted she had done no harm, had cast no spells, had spoken no pacts. Her sin in the eyes of Salem was her absence, her sickness that kept her from church, her second marriage that blurred social lines, her frailty that could not disguise itself as innocence. She never made it to trial. The conditions in the Boston jail, cramped, dark, freezing, did what the court had not yet done. They killed her. She died in early May, her name still inked on the docket, her charges unresolved, her burial unmarked. There was no ceremony, no headstone, no acknowledgement. Her death, like her life in those final months, passed without noise between them. These two women represented everything that Salem feared. Sarah Good, the angry indigestion repping; Sarah Osborne, the quiet, sickly, socially distant. Both refused to confess, and both were punished not for what they had done, but for what they refused to become. Liars in the service of hysteria. Their fates were instructive. In the weeks that followed, more people would be accused, and many, watching what happened to Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, would make a different choice. They would confess, they would fabricate, they would save themselves by naming others, they would lie to survive, and so the truth became something dangerous. To be innocent was to be brave was to be stubborn, and to be stubborn was to die in the dim light of Ingersoll's tavern, with the smell of damp wood, sweat, and anxiety thick in the air. Tituba sat before a table lined with judges, ministers, and scribes. Her wrists wear off from rope, her eyes dark, cautious, unreadable, moved carefully between them and who had summoned her, and the girls who had screamed at her presence just hours earlier. She had already been questioned once before. She had denied everything. She had said she was innocent. She had said the devil had no place in her soul, but now the stakes had changed. The air had grown colder, not with weather, but with judgment. She saw it in the faces of the magistrates. They were not waiting for proof, they were waiting for permission. The afflicted girls had already performed, had already gasped and convulsed and pointed, and now that remained was for anyone to explain it. And Tituba, as the most vulnerable, the most foreign, the least protected person in the room, was expected to carry that burden. The interrogation intensified. The magistrates asked not only what she had done, but whom she had done it with. They asked what form the devil had taken. They asked about dreams, about Books about dancing in the woods, each question held the weight of a command, every denial seemed to prolong her suffering, and every moment she hesitated was treated as complicity, eventually under pressure that no transcript could ever fully capture. Tuba broke, or perhaps strategically adapted. She began to speak, and what she said reshaped the course of history. Her voice at first was tentative, as if she herself were uncertain where the story would go. She said that the devil had come to her faith, had appeared as a man dressed in black with hollow eyes and strange words, that he carried a great book and asked her to sign her name. Inside, she said she had done it. She had signed, but she wasn't alone. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were there too. They had all signed, they had all flown, they had all attended the devil's meetings. Beneath the trees at night, surrounded by beasts and spirits, the judges leaned forward, the scribes scribbled furiously, the afflicted girls sat eerily still as if soothed by the confirmation that their visions were true. And Tuba continued. She spoke of a yellow bird that followed her, of a hairy creature with the head of a man and the body of a dog. She said a tall man had told her to hurt the children, to prick them with invisible needles and choke them in their dreams. She described seeing witches riding on poles through the sky, and a gathering in the woods where everyone drank red liquid from a horn. She said the devil promised freedom, he promised silk clothes, he promised Theppower to strike down her enemies. She did not say she believed him, but she said she listened. What she offered was more than a confession. It was a mythos, a narrative via framework that the court could use to justify what it had already decided to do. Tuba didn't just tell them what they wanted to hear. She gave them a world to believe in, a shadow world that mirrored their fears and rewarded their righteousness. Her tale made everything make sense: the girls' fits, the nightmares, the sudden illnesses, the unexplainable guilt that lived in so many of their hearts. And by naming Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, she fed the system the fuel it needed to grow. With every word she purchased her survival at a cost she could not yet comprehend. The effect of her confession was immediate and powerful to the core. Their story confirmed that there was a vast unseen conspiracy spreading through the colony. Like mold beneath floorboards, it was no longer a matter of whether witches were real or if the girls were lying. The confession erased thoughts of questions. If Tuba said she had flown, then flight was possible. If she said there were more witches, then there must be dozens, maybe hundreds, hiding among them, wearing plain clothes, pretending to be godly. But Tita was not set free. Despite her cooperation, she remained in jail, not because she was still feared, but because she was enslaved as the property of Reverend Paris. She could not simply be released into the streets. She had no money, no family, no one willing to pay the jail fees required to secure her freedom. So she lingered month after month in a cell too small for dignity, with straw that smelled of mildew, and a future that narrowed with every day that passed. And yet she was alive. Her survival became an unspoken lesson to others. The court had shown its preference. It did not value truth, it valued submission. It did not reward honesty, it rewarded narrative. Tuba's confession became a model, a template for others who found themselves accused and desperate. Her story would be echoed, expanded, and embellished by countless others who realized that to live they too would need to lie. And as more people followed that path, confessing, naming others, weaving dreams into testimony, the court's sense of purpose deepened. The accused were no longer individuals, they were part of something vast, a network, a movement, a moral infection. Tuba had not only saved herself from the noose, she had given the Salem Witch Trials their engine, and once that engine started turning, it would not stop. Not for truth, not for tears, not even for the innocent. It began with 3 women, then 5, then a dozen, but soon the accusations no longer trickled, they cascaded like stones tumbling down a hillside. Each new name dislodged another. One confession led to a second to a third, and then to many more, and so it spread with a velocity that defied logic and a hunger that devoured reason. By the spring of 1692, Salem had ceased to function like a town. It now resembled a stage, or perhaps more accurately a battlefield, where the weapon of choice wasn't sword or flame, but a whisper that had begun in the parsonage with a pair of frightened girls, had escaped its cradle and infected the community. At large, it crept into churches, darkened dinner tables, poisoned wells of friendship. Entire families looked at one another sideways. Neighbors crossed streets to avoid casual greetings. Every silence was suspicious. Every friendship scrutinized. Every prayer watched for hesitation. And what made it all the more terrifying was how effortlessly people turned on each other once it became known that a confession could save your life. Albeit temporarily, many seized the opportunity not simply to survive, but to strike. It was safer to speak than to remain quiet, and far more tempting to redirect suspicion than to absorb it. People began naming others acquaintances to former rivals. Old lovers arranged kinship, did it out of desperation, others out of convenience. A few, it seems, may have done it with calculation. The court, which had originally treated confessions as remarkable, even rare, began to expect them. Spectral evidence, visions, dreams, claims of invisible assault remained the foundation of the trials, but now direct accusations from one accused witch to another became the firewood that kept the blaze. Alavetituba's confession had opened the gate. Now everyone understood the rules. To lie was to live, to tell the truth was to die, to say nothing was to vanish in chains. Even the innocent, those with spotless reputations and long-standing ties to the church, began to feel the fire licking at their heels. Their only hope, it seemed, was to preempt it, to confess before being accused, to accuse before being condemned. The judicial system had inverted itself. Guilt was proven by honesty, and innocence was punished with a rope. The court did not discourage this. In fact, it formalized it. Each confession came with names, sometimes one, often several. These names led to new arrests. Those new arrests led to more interrogations, and those interrogations to more confessions. The process spiraled not because of any central conspiracy, but because fear, ancien institutiones, generates its own momentum. This wasn't just Salem Village anymore. By May, the accusations spilled into Salem town, and from there into neighboring communities like Andover, Ipswich, and Topsfield. The panic no longer belonged to a single parish, it belonged to Massachusetts. The jails overflowed. There were so many prisoners that local facilities could no longer contain them. An overflow was sent to Boston and other towns. People of all ages, from septuagenarians to toddlers, were shackled and packed into dark, damp cells where food was scarce and disease spread freely. The accused were sometimes kept in irons so tight they lost circulation in their limbs. Some died before their cases were ever heard. Others were lost in the shuffle, their names forgotten even as their families starved trying to pay the jailer's fees. And the court, rather than slowing, grew more efficient. It was no longer investigating, it was processing. The magistrates viewed cases quickly. If the afflicted girl screamed, it was seen as corroboration. If the accused so much as looked uneasy, it was labeled guilt. Testimonies were recorded, but not questioned. Spectral evidence was weighed alongside rumored dreams and hearsay. Physical evidence was unnecessary, as the judges believed the devil worked invisibly. As the flood of accusations continued to rise, it became clear that the existing local courts were no longer sufficient to contain the volume or velocity of Salem's witch panic. The townspeople weren't just demanding answers, they were demanding action. The jails were full, the rumors unrelenting. The unease was contagious, and so in May of 1692, Governor William Phips created a new judicial body, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, charged with hearing and determining cases of witchcraft in Essex, Suffolk, and Middlesex counties. On the surface, the formation of this special court might have seemed a pragmatic step, an organized way to resolve an increasingly chaotic situation, but in truth, what the governor had constructed was not a venue for careful justice. It was a mechanism designed to confirm the fears of the public and accelerate the purging. With men like William Stoughton, a stern and deeply religious magistrate, as its chief justice, the court was not interested in skepticism or balance. It was focused on rooting out spiritual rot, and it would use any tool necessary to do so. And the tool it relied on most heavily was something no true court of reason would ever accept: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was by definition invisible and unverifiable. It consisted of testimony that the specter or ghost-like form of an accused person had appeared to the afflicted and harmed them. The logic, if it could be called, that was this: while a person's physicality may be at rest or in jail, their spirit could be sent forth by the devil to torment others. And if the afflicted girls said they saw your spirit choking them, biting them, or pinning them to the wall, then your guilt was assumed. There were no marks on the skin, no footprints in the soil, no witnesses save the girls themselves. But none of that mattered to the judges of the court of Oy and Terminer. The girls, trembling, screaming, and sobbing, were considered the testimony of the soul, not the senses. It was in many ways a perfect system, especially for those who believe that the devil walked among them. If the devil was subtle, then his agents would be subtle too. If witches were capable of deception, then any lack of evidence against them might only mean they were more cunning than expected. Under this reasoning, denial became suspicious, confession virtuous, and invisible crimes pain the only ones. The court was truly equipped to prosecute. The court convened its first formal session in early June, and by mid-May had already handed down its first death sentence. That sentence fell on Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her sharp-tongued, colorful clothing and history of legal disputes with neighbors. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, decades earlier, but had been acquitted. No, her past was used against her, repackaged and magnified. The afflicted girls claimed they saw her spirit tormenting them. She was accused of keeping puppets, dolls used in sympathetic magic, and of bewitching a neighbor's pig. Bishop denied it all. She declared her innocence with clarity and frustration. She claimed she feared God, that she had never dealt in dark arts, that she was a good Christian woman. But her tone, forceful, indignant, unapologetic, was not what the court wanted to hear. Her refusal to submit was interpreted not as confidence, but arrogance. The girls screamed when she entered the room. They fainted when she looked at them. They convulsed when she tried to speak, and the judges listened to them, not her. She was found guilty on June 10, 1692. Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill. There was no prayer, no blessing. Her grave was unmarked. Her name, written in ink on the court scrolls, became Amelstone, not the beginning of caution, but the green light for a campaign of destruction that was only just beginning. From that point forward, the court accelerated its process. More than 60 people stood accused by early July. The afflicted girls testified in trial after trial, often giving near identical accounts of pain, suffocation, burning, and spectral visitation. The judges asked no follow-up questions. They rarely pressed for consistency. They allowed hearsay, dreams, and visions to take the place of fact. One particularly disturbing form of evidence was the touch test. If an afflicted person was in a fit and the accused laid hands on them and the fit ceased, this was taken as proof that Thecast had been controlling the fit with their magic. The logic was reversed. The accused were assumed guilty, and a physical coincidence became validation of that guilt. A few voices in the colony dared to question this madness. Reverend Increase Mather, one of New England's most respected ministers, swore that it was better that 10 witches escape than one innocent person be condemned. But by the time he spoke, Heath hangings had already begun. Nathaniel Saltonstall, one of the appointed judges, resigned in protest after Bridget Bishop's execution, but his seat was quickly filled. His absence was not a turning point. It was a footnote, and so the court continued. The judges believed they were doing holy work, that they were reconciled, that the cost of a few earthly lives was a price worth paying to protect eternity. They were wrong, but they would not realize it. Not yet. In their chambers they sharpened the quills on the scaffold, they tightened the ropes, and on the gallows the bodies began to swing. By the summer of 1692, it had become clear to the accused that innocence was not a shield, it was a sentence. Those who stood firm and declared with unshakable faith that they had never signed the devil's book or consorted with demons were led to the gallows. But those who whispered, yes, those who murmured what the court wanted to hear, were allowed to live. At least for a while, confession became a weapon not of guilt but of survival. The first few confessions had shocked the town. Tuba's vivid stories of dark meetings in the woods and flying spirits were seen as remarkable at the time, even scandalous. But as more people saw what that confession had bought her time, attention, even sympathy, they began to consider it not as betrayal, but as strategy. If one could lie convincingly and name others along the way, the court would often grant mercy, and so, one by one, the confessions began to roll in deliverance. Hobbs admitted to witchcraft and said she had flown through the air at the devil's command. Mary Warren, who had once been among the afflicted, reversed course and claimed that she herself had become a witch under pressure. Abigail Hobbs, only 14 years old, confessed as well, describing Satan as a black dog with yellow eyes who promised her a better life. Some spoke of red marks and spectral birds, others of dark books and invisible Sabbaths. The more fantastical the tale, more seriously it was taken, and when asked who else had joined them, they gave names. Sometimes they accused their enemies, sometimes they accused stranger Semites, they accused their own family. One woman named her mother a boy, the Metis brother. Entire households became splintered under the weight of forced survival, and each new name gave Thecart new purpose. The more people were accused, the more it validated the crisis, more it justified the court's existence. There was no incentive to hold. The Lineth system punished dignity and rewarded betrayal, so people chose a betrayal. But that didn't mean it was easy. Confession did not erase the pain, it didn't clear one's name. It didn't even ensure safety. Those who confessed were still jailed, sometimes for months, still shackled, still forced to watch others hang. They were still hungry, still cold, still uncertain of whether the court might change its mind. But at least they were alive, and in a world where the sound of the gallows creaking had become familiar, staying alive at any cost felt like thinly rational goal. Yet not everyone followed that path. Some refused, even knowing what it meant. Rebecca, nurse, old, pious, beloved by her church, never confessed. Not when the court demanded it, not when her neighbors begged her to, not even when she stood beneath the hanging tree. Her silence was not confusion, it was defiance. She had been declared not guilty at first, a rare breath of reason in a room thick with madness, but it didn't last. As the verdict echoed through the court, the afflicted girls collapsed again into shrieks and spasms. Their theatrics worked. The judges recalled the jury. The decision was reversed. Mercy was revoked, and Rebecca, who had touched the edge of freedom, was sentenced to hang. John Proctor, a man of pride and temper, also refused. He saw the court for what it was, a circus of panic masked in robes, and declared it. So he told them that the girls were liars, that the judges were being manipulated, that the entire town had gone mad. He begged for justice, for reason, for decency. And for that he was sentenced to die before Faith wrote letters, urgent, furious, desperate, pleading with the ministers of Boston to intervene, to stop the slaughter, to listen. But no one came. His words vanished like steam against the iron wall of silence and they took his name, but not his soul. He would rather die than damn himself with Allie, his wife. Elizabeth Proctor, also accused, was spared only because she was pregnant. Her execution was delayed until she gave birth, a delay that would later become a reprieve when the court began to unravel. But she too refused to leave, and with a child growing inside her, even with death imminent, she would not damn her soul to save Herbity. Others, like Giles Corey, took their resistance further. When charged, Hare refused to enter a plea. He knew that if he pleaded, he would be tried, found guilty, and executed, and his property will be forfeited to the state. But by staying silent, he denied the court jurisdiction to punish him. They U.S. pressing a medieval form of torture in which heavy stones were placed upon the chest until the body could take no more. He endured it for days. When asked to plead, he reported said only more way. He died without confessing. Hisland passed to his sons. His silence became a kind of legend, but he died in agony. The courts, of course, saw no heroism in these denials. They saw obstinacy, rebellion, proof of guilt. But to the few who watched with eyes not yet clouded by fear, these acts of resistance revealed a truth. The court refused to face the unlie. People confessing were those who feared death more than dishonor. The court did not deal in forgiveness. It dealt in self-preservation, and every false confession it accepted only deepened fine justice. Because with each name uttered more lives were ruined, more noose prepared, more graves dug the witches, it seemed. Multiplied. But they weren't multiplying because the devil was expanding his reach. They were multiplying because the court was demanding it. It was a harvest fed by least to truth, as it turns out had no place in Salem, not in its jails, not in its skirt rooms, and certainly not on its scaffold by midsummer. The rhythm of Salem had changed the Sabbath. Bells still rang, sermons were still preached, and the marketplace still bustled with the exchange of fish grain and gossip, but something darker had settled into the town's bones. What had begun as a spiritual crisis had become a routine of death trials. No longer felt like moments of decision. They felt like formality-ish, necessary prelude to a sentence already written. After Bridget Bishop, the executions became more frequent. On July 19th, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca's death struck many as unbearable. She was 71 years old, a beloved matron of the church, known for her piety, her calmness, her care for the sick. Even the jury had initially found her not guilty until pressured by the judges to reconsider in the end. A moment of hesitation in her testimony, one misunderstood phrase was enough to seal her fate. She went to the gallows in silence. When asked for a final confession, she said only, "I am innocent, I have no one to accuse." She died with dignity, but dignity did not save her. In August, the tempo increased again. 5 more executions, this time including Martha Carrier, whom Cotton Mather had called the Queen of Hell. Her children had been tortured into confessing that she had bewitched them. Her neighbors had testified that her presence brought misfortune. She maintained her innocence until fiend they hanged her anyway. Each hanging followed the same pattern. The accused were taken in an open cart through the center of town. The people gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others brought their children. It was treated like a necessary evil. A ritual of cleansing. The condemned were offered one last chance to confess. Some did, most didn't. The noose was placed, the cart was kicked away, the body swung. There was no burial. The corpses were cut down and dumped into shallow, unmarked pits. Families were forbidden from retrieving them. The bodies of the accused, even in death, were denied dignity. They became warning symbols, proof that the courts were doing their work. By September, the fear reached its peak. 8 people were hanged in a single day. One of them was John Proctor, a man of considerable land and status. His pleas to the court, his reasoned lettershus arguments against the use of spectral evidence had gone unheard. His wife Elizabeth remained in jail, her execution postponed only because she was pregnant. John died with no confession. He had been vocal to the end, accusing the court itself of witchcraft, of bewitching the people into believing in lies. Another was Mary East, sister of Rebecca Nurse. She had been released, then rearrested after new accusations. She wrote a letter to the court before her execution, begging them not to accept further spectral evidence. It was polite, sorrowful, and heartfelt. It was ignored. And then there was Giles Corey. He was never hanged. He refused to stand trial. To plead either guilty or not guilty would have given the court power over him. So he said nothing. Astonishment. He was pressed to death. He died without a plea, and because of that his land remained in his family's name. His silence, like Proctor's words, became legend by autumn. The executions were no longer shocking. They were expected. The gallows became a fixture. The people adjusted to the sound of verdicts and the sight of wagons carrying the condemned uphill. And those who watched, who once cried or prayed or trembled, begging to do so less. There was a numbness, now a dedicament. Salem was no longer a village hunting witches. It had become a village watching itself bleed. By the time the leaves began to fall in 1692, Salem's court was no longer a tribunal in search of justice. It had become a machine for controlled destruction, one that could not be stopped without risking the collapse of the very authority that had built it. The magistrates, once seen as wise guardians of law, had transformed into figures of dread. Their black robes no longer represented impartiality, but a kind of secretal power, unquestioned, unsympathetic, and increasingly serving. And at the center of it all stood Chief Magistrate William Stoughton. Was not a man easily swayed, educated, rigid, deeply devout. He had made up his mind early on that Satan was real, that witches were his agents, and that New England was under siege. In his worldview, doubt was not caution, it was cowardice. He believed that it was better to err on the side of punishment than to risk letting a guilty soul escape divine retribution, and so with grim certainty he presided over trial after trial, welcoming confession, encouraging accusation, and defending the use of spectral evidence with unshakable resolve to Stoughton and others. Like him, justice was no longer about fairness, it was about control. And when control is threatened, truth becomes optional behind the scenes. That control was unraveling. Whispers began to circulate that the court was being manipulated, not by Satan but by men with agendas. One of the most infamous was Thomas Putnam, father of afflicted girl Ann Putnam Jr., and a man with long-standing grievances and ambitions. His daughter's accusations seemed to fall with eerie precision upon those who owned land adjacent to Histos, with whom he had legal quarrels, or those whose removal would somehow strengthen his position in Thevelage. It was never proven, but it didn't need to be. The timing spoke volumes. The patterns were undeniable, and still the court accepted every word, because to question the motives behind an accusation was to question the accuser's divine sensitivity, and to question that was to flirt with her reserve. System fed on this silence. It relied on it. Every player, judge, juror, accuser, and neighbor understood that the rules had changed, and anyone who challenged them did so at their own peril. Some tried. Reverend John Hale, one of the early supporters of the trials, began to hesitate when his own wife was accused. Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, as mentioned earlier, had resigned in protest after the execution of Bridget Bishop. His absence should have sparked introspection, but instead it was filled by another who followed the script more obediently. Even Governor Phipps, who had established the court himself, began to sense that things had spiraled beyond control, particularly when accusations reached his own circle. But the system resisted every attempt at restraint. Stoughton, in particular, pushed forward with a kind of righteous fervor. He ignored petitions, he overruled appeals, he upheld verdicts. Even when new evidence emerged in one case, a man was convicted solely on the basis of spectral evidence and hanged despotepratists from other ministers. Stoughton later claimed that God would sort out the innocent from the guilty in afterlife. For now the court's duty was to act, and act swiftly. In the background, families wept, children were orphaned, property was seized, and a new kind of fear took root. Not fear of witches, but fear of Thekord itself. Ordinary citizens began to wonder if the trials would ever end, or if, like a fire that had consumed the forest, it would eventually turn on the village itself. The afflicted girls, emboldened by their power, began naming more and more people. The scope widened. Ministers, magistrates, even Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, and with that the illusion cracked, because while it had been easy to believe in witches when they were poor, isolated, or strange, it became harder to believe when the net caught the powerful. If even the governor's wife could be accused, then who was safe? Ivory denial was proof of guilt. Then how could anyone survive? The same people who once whispered approval of the trials now whispered something else. Had they gone too far? And what would happen when Salem had no one left to hang but its own judges? But justice, when twisted, does not apologize, it doubles down. And in those final weeks of the trials, that's exactly what the court did. The executions continued, the jails remained full, the petitions for clemency were rejected, and the girls were still believed until finally the machine overreached, when the accusations threatened to engulf the entire colony's leadership, when wives of governors and ministers were being named, when even Stoughton's allies began to question the court's direction. Governor Phipps stepped in. And Stoughton, he was furious. He protested the governor's decision to halt executions. He insisted that those already sentenced should hang regardless of political consequence. He even sought to continue the trials under new pretexts, but the tide had turned, and though justice in Salem had long since been lost, something else now rose in its place. Self-preservation among the powerful. The very people who had allowed the court to flourish were now the ones dismantling it, not out of remorse but out of fear that they would be next. And so slowly, reluctantly, the wheels began to slow, but the damage had already been done. What had once been a courtroom was now a graveyard. What had once been a village had become a warning, and those who had played the game, whether for belief, ambition, or survival, would carry its weight for the rest of their lives of eerie. Fire eventually runs out of fuel in the early months of the Salem Witch panic. That fuel had been easy to find: poor women, outcasts, the sick, the outspoken, the odd. The town fed on them one by one. But when so many of the obvious suspects were gone, and the court still needed bodies, the accusations began to crawl inward into the center of the village's life. The witch hunt no longer stalked the edges, it began to chew through its own heart, and Salem finally began to feel it. September 1692. Accusations were no longer aimed just at widows, beggars, or those already mistrusted. Instead, they reached into the homes of ministers, merchants, respected church members, even the relatives of the judges themselves. Wives of magistrates were named, so were cousins of clergymen. Longtime allies off court found their doors knocked on. Friends who had whispered their support for the trials suddenly found their own names whispered back. It became a mirror Salem could no longer bear to look into. Mary East, sister of the hanged Rebecca Nurse, had been released from prison after a long interrogation. Her family rejoiced briefly, but within days the afflicted girls claimed her specter had returned. New fits, new screams. Thecourt reversed its decision. She was arrested again. She wrote a letter to the judge, not begging for her own life, but for the end of all executions. Her words were calm, haunting, soaked in dignity and sorrow. I petition your honors, not for my own life, but for the lives of others, that no more innocent blood. Best they hanged her anyway. Then came Anne Foster, an elderly woman, an end of her frail and near death after days of isolation. Interrogation, seeing her daughter and granddaughter both accused. She confessed, not because she believed it, not because it was true, but because the weight of survival fell heavier than the truth. She died in prison. The court had crossed into new territory. It was no longer simply condemning the powerless, it was turning on the very people who had enabled it. Even Ann Putnam Jr., one of the original afflicted girls, began accusing people closer to home. She said her former caretaker had bewitched her. She accused a minister's wife. She turned on old friends and her father. Thomas Putnam, once thought to be orchestrating of the chaos, began to lose control of it. No one could direct the storm anymore. The hysteria that had once been aimed with precision now moved like smoke, drifting, unpredictable, deadly. A neighbor's silence was suspect. A widow's grief was suspicious. A minister's frown at the wrong moment could become an omen. The entire village became a theater of self-surveillance. Those who had been quick to accuse now grew quiet. Those who had urged caution now dared to speak louder, and those who had said nothing at all began to ask, what if it's me next? The courts, sensing the tremors, pushed harder. More arrests, more confessions, more gallows. But for the first time, cracks began to show. People who once believed the afflicted girls without hesitation now raised eyebrows. The girls' fits become more elaborate, their stories more bizarre, their circle of accused wider than ever before. Some villagers began to mutter that the devil might not be in the accused, but in the accusers. Then came the final straw when the afflicted girls named Lady Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, very man who had established the court of Oy and Terminer. The absurdity could no longer be ignored. Thecourt had begun to devour its creators, and with that the house of cards began to collapse. The governor moved swiftly. He dissolved the special court, replacing it with a new judicial body, one that would no longer accept spectral evidence, one that would actually require something resembling proof. Trials were suspended. Some prisoners were released. Confessions were re-evaluated. Those who had not yet been executed were suddenly, awkwardly spared. But there were no public apologies, no ceremonies to honor the dead, no reparations, no proclamations of error. Instead, Salem entered a kind of stunned silence. The gallows stood empty, its rope still swaying in memory. The jails no longer echoed with screams, but remained crowded with the forgotten. The families of the dead returned to homes that now felt like tombs. The afflicted girls stopped having fits, just like thought, as if nothing had happened, but something had, and everyone knew. If town that once burned with righteous certainty now sat in a fog of shame. The church, that had claimed to root out evil, now struggled to explain its own complicity. The judges who had sentenced niggers to die now walked through town with their heads low, pretending the dust on their hands was no different from anyone else's, and the people, they whispered, they wondered, and many perhaps for the first time, began to regret, not loudly, not together, but late at night in corners in prayer and guilt. Because the fire was out, but the ashes were still warm, when Governor William Phipps returned to Massachusetts from a military campaign in the North. He found a colonial regal Salem, once a rigidly devout but orderly town, had transformed it into a place of whispers and gallows, of crying children and unmarked graves. What had begun as a flicker of spiritual concern had become a judicial inferno, fueled by fear, then pride, then momentum. Had left behind a church grumbling about deviance. Returned to find a legal system hanging its own people on the strength of invisible evidence. But what made the change real, what pulled him out of the fog of political hesitation, was not the bodies already buried. It was the moment the accusations came for his own wife. The afflicted girls, once believed to be mere vessels of divine sensitivity, had named Lady Mary Phipps, whether they meant to, whether they were manipulated, or whether it was the natural progression of a panic that could no longer distinguish between guilt and proximity. The message landed with brutal clarity. No one was safe anymore, not even the governor's family. Phipps did not hesitate. In late October 1692 had dissolved the court of Owe and Terminer, the same tribunal he had commissioned just months earlier. He ordered that no more arrests were to be made for witchcraft, and declared that spectral evidence would no longer be admissible in court. Without it, the cases collapsed almost immediately. Testimonies that once had girls writhing on the courtroom floor now fell flat. Accusers were met with silence. Judges sat still. The wind had changed, and the fire finally began. Tody, a new court was established, the Superior Court of Judicature, with different rules, different standards, and perhaps most importantly, a different sense of caution. The frenzy had peaked, and now slowly the structure built on its hysteria began to fall in on itself. But there was no celebration. There was no public reckoning, no ringing of bells, no downwide fast of repentance. There was only quiet, an exhausted, heavy kind of quiet. The gallows stood untouched, its frame grayed by weather and memory. The jails remained full, though none new names were added to the rolls. The court scribes, once so busy cataloging charges and deaths, now returned to documenting releases, petitions, and fatal paperwork of reversal. Phipps never admitted fault, blamed the chaos on the judges and the afflicted girls. He suggested that the court had moved too quickly, that perhaps too much trust had been placed in popular fury. He pardoned those still imprisoned. Many were released, but not all at once. Some lingered in jail, not because they were still suspected of witchcraft, but because they could not pay their jail fees, the cruel toll exacted for food shackles and straw bedding. Even Tatuba, whose confession had started the fire, remained behind bars for months. No one paid to retrieve her. Reverend Paris, her master, refused. She was eventually sold to another family, and after that she vanished from the record. No death certificate, no gravestone, just silence. Many others who survived emerged to find their lives in ruin. John Proctor's widow, Elizabeth, gave birth in jail. Though spared from execution, she returned to a home without a husband, a reputation stained by accusation, and a child born into a name the town no longer spoke with respect. Rebecca Nurse's family, devastated by her execution, secretly dug up her body from the site near Gallows Hill and reared her on their farm under the cover of darkness. The state had refused to return the body, so her children, with quiet rage, took her back. Others who had confessed to save themselves now bore the weight of those confessions. They had named friends Nigger's family. They had lied in desperation, and though it had bought their lives, it had also left them. Branded, the court may have closed, but the shame didn't. In sermons, ministers attempted to shift the narrative. Some called the trials a test from God. Others suggested that the devil had tricked the court itself, that even righteous men could be used for dark purposes. But in private, the conversations were harder in parlors and taverns. In pews, people remembered who had accused, who had testified, who had cheered, When the cart rolled toward Gallows Hill, they also remembered who had died, and no amount of theological spinning could change that. As for William Stoughton, the chief judge, who had presided over most of the executions, he never apologized. He would go on to serve again as acting governor, never questioned the court's actions, never expressed regret in his eyes. The trials had been a necessary purge, a sacrifice for spiritual clarity, and that is perhaps the final tragedy. Because justice in Salem wasn't undone by remorse, it was undone by convenience. The trials didn't stop because the town rediscovered its conscience. They stopped because the court had turned on its own creators, and those in power saw that continuing the executions might cost them more than it gained. In the end, what halted the madness wasn't virtue, it was self-preservation, and the people of Salem were left to sort through the wreckage alone, with their dead buried in secret, their names blackened, and their faith bruised in ways no church could mend. The executions ended, the court dissolved, the noose hung unused, and Gallows Hill fell silent. But for Thassa, who survived the witch trials, life did not simply resume. There were no welcome home banners, no public absolution, no sense that the nightmare had passed and the world had reset. What came after was not recovery, it was something colder, a long uneasy silence where healing should have been. Those who had confessed and lived were not celebrated. They returned to homes stripped bare, to communities that regarded them with suspicion. Neighbors starved without speaking. Church pews seemed smaller, colder. A man who once confessed under pressure now found his business avoided. A woman who had saved herself by naming others walked through market like a ghost, knowing that behind every glance might be the face of someone whose mother had hanged. Confession, once a ticket to life, had become a lifelong curse. Even those who had never confessed, who had stood firm and survived, were not greeted as heroes. Some had escaped execution only because the court had closed in time. Others had been released after months in jail, emaciated, scarred by cold and hunger. They stepped out off prison gates, not into celebration, but into uncertainty. Elizabeth Proctor, widow of John Proctor, had given birth in her cell. Her execution had been delayed for that reason alone. When she was released, her husband was gone, her home was depleted, and her name, once respected, was whispered with pity or resentment. Though later her conviction would be formally reversed, the town offered no restitution, no rebuilding of what had been lost. Tituba, whose confession had ignited Thecourt's fury, remained behind bars long after others were freed, not because she was feared, but because no one wanted to pay the cost of her release. In the end, she was sold to an unknown new master, and with that transaction her story vanished. She disappears from the record, not hanged, not pardoned, simply erased. Then there were those who had endured prison for months without conviction. Families went bankrupt paying jail fees. Some prisoners were released only when friends or distant relatives managed to scrape together enough to satisfy the court's financial demands. If no one came for you, you stayed. In a sense, meant nothing. Debts meant everything. Anne Foster, aged and frail, had confessed only after being isolated, threatened, and told that her daughter and granddaughter would hang if shed, and she died in prison before the court changed its mind. Her body was never recovered. Her family buried the memory in silence. Some survivors tried to rebuild. They went back to their homes if they still had them. They tried to return to their churches if they were still welcomed. Some remarried, some moved away, others never left but never truly came back. Either they existed in a kind of social limbo, not criminal, but not clean, not cursed, but not forgiven. The town itself didn't speak of it. No, publicly there were no monuments erected, no official days of mourning. Gallows Hill was left unmarked. The graves of the executed were not honored. Their bodies dumped into crevices and ravines were denied even the dignity of a headstone. Many families quietly, secretly retrieved their loved ones' remains in the dead-off night and buried them in family plots without ceremony, and yet the names lingered. The silence around them was heavy. Every church service, every wedding, every funeral after 1693 carried the weight of those who weren't their people once trusted, now gone, left behind by a town that had traded justice for panic. And still there were the children. They were supposed to be innocent in them. Theology of the Puritan children were often viewed as vessels of sin waiting to be shaped by faith and discipline, but they were still by nature impressional and dependent, rarely granted full agency, and yet in surrendering the trials children were not only given voices, they were given power, enough symbolic power of moral instruction or religious example, but literal legal power, the kind that sent people to their deaths. It began with a handful of girls: Betty, Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, and several others, ranging in age from 9 to 16, first exhibited symptoms of what the court would later call affliction. They screamed, they convulsed, they pointed into empty space and claimed invisible torments at first. They were pied, then believed, then venerated. Their suffering was interpreted not as theater nor misbehavior, but as evidence of divinatory. They were seen as victims of the devil's intrusion into the physical world, chosen to express evil, but something subtle and terrible happened over the weeks that followed. Their suffering became performance, and their performance was given the force of flaw. The afflicted girls began to appear in courtrooms regularly, not as defendants or observers, but as star witnesses. They would fall into spasms the moment an accused witch was brought into the room. They claimed they were being scratched, bitten, burned, or choked, though their bodies bore no marks. They shrieked, collapsed, and called out names, sometimes clearly, sometimes as riddles that the judges seemed all too willing to solve on their behalf, and the court believed them unquestioningly to the magistrates. These girls were not simply sick, they were spiritually sensitive, like human barometers for satanic activity. If they screamed, someone must be hurting them. If they pointed, someone must be guilty. And when their accusations turned to people of higher social standing, landowners, ministers, wives, community leaders, their credibility was not diminished, it was elevated. It meant the devil was cunning, hiding himself among the righteous. No one questioned why the girls' visions conveniently aligned with village gossip, personal disputes, or long-held grudges. No one dared suggest that the children were lying or confused, or swept up in a shared delusion. To doubt the afflicted was to doubt the existence of evil, and in Salem, such doubt was dangerous. Worse still, children who were not afflicted but merely present became tools of the court in even more tragic ways. Children like Dorothy Good, who wasn't for when she was imprisoned, she had confessed if her incoherent, frightened mumblings could be called that. She had spoken of a snake, of a strange friend her mother talked to, and that was enough. She was kept in chains. By the time she was released, she could barely speak. According to later reports, her mind perhaps had not recovered. Others, like Ann Putnam Jr., carried different scars. She had been one of the first accusers, 12 years old, sharp, devout, and eager to please. Over the course of the trials, she had named more than 60 people, ministers, neighbors, friends. 14 years later, in 1706, she stood before the congregation of Salem Village Church and delivered a written confession. I desire to be humbled before God forthwith. Sad and humbling providence that I was the instrument of accusing several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken from them, whom I now have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent. The congregation forgave her. The dead, of course, could not even in confession. Anne claimed she had been deceived by Satan. She did not claim to have lied, and in doing so she echoed the same theology that had made the trials possible in the first place, that evil moves silently, that it takes many forms, that even the innocent can be its pawns. There were no trials for the judges, no punishments for the accusers, no official apology from the church. Not yet. The survivors lived in the ruins, not of a war, not of a fire, but of trust. Fabric of Salem society, its belief in community and justice, in godliness, had been burned through. Those who survived did not walk away with peace they carried, instead a new fear, quieter, colder, and perhaps more dangerous than the one that started it all. The fear that truth can be erased, that conscience can be silenced, and that when power decides someone is guilty, survival may depend not on innocence, but on silence or complicity. And in that silence the town waited not for justice but for time to do what no court had done. By the end of 1693, The great engine of the Salem Witch Trials, built in fear, powered by confession, and steered by ambition, had finally run out. Names out of breath and out of permission, but it did not die in a dramatic collapse. There was no singular moment when the colony rose up and denounced its own courts. There were no shattered gavels, no mobs demanding reparations. Instead, the death of justice came quietly, like the last echo of a hymn no longer sung. The superior court of judicature, created to replace the court of oyer and terminer, heard the remaining witchcraft cases with a new standard: no spectral evidence. Without it, the entire structure of accusation, so reliant on dreams and visions, fell apart almost immediately. Cases that would have once drawn gasps now drew silence. Witnesses stumbled, testimony lost its shape, and one by one defendants who might have died weeks earlier were acquitted or quietly dismissed. But the court didn't declare its prior rulings void. There was no retroactive correction for those already buried on Gallows Hill. No one stood to say, "We were wrong." The very judges who had sent 20 Pleto their deaths now returned to their homes, resumed their duties, and went on with their lives. William Stoughton, who had presided over nearly every execution, remained unrepentant. He never apologized. He believed the court had done what was necessary. When he later became acting governor, he offered no words of regret in his mind. The dead had not been victims. They had been risks. Better to eliminate too many than allow evil to go unpunished. It would take years for even a fraction of acknowledgement to arrive. In 1697, 5 years after the executions, the General Court of Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and soul-searching, calling it a day of humiliation. It was not an apology. It wasn't addressed to the families. It was more like an awkward clearing of the throat, an official suggestion that perhaps something had gone wrong, though no one would say exactly what. That same year, Samuel C. one-off judges did what no one else in authority had yet dared. He stood during a church service, bowed his head, and publicly repented. He admitted that the court had erred, that he had erred, that Heber guilt for innocent blood. His confession was not flamboyant. He did not weep, but he stood long enough for everyone to see him, and his prayer was later published. It became the first true gesture of repentance, and the only one for quite some time. Most of the others stayed silent. The afflicted girls never stood trial for their testimony. The ministers who endorsed the court were not removed from their pulpits. The sheriff who signed the death warrants lived out his days undisturbed. There were no formal charges against the accusers, and no inquiry into the incentives behind their claims. The town, perhaps desperate to move forward, allowed a strange agreement to take hold. We will not speak of it, and in return, we will not ask who benefited most. But silence does not bury the truth. In the years that followed, the pain endured quietly, persistently. Families of the executed struggled to reclaim land, reputations, and basic dignity. Children grew up with names soiled by history. The grandchildren of the dead listened to sermons delivered by men who had stood at the edge of the gallows and said nothing, and those who had lived through it learned to live around it. They avoided certain topics. They stepped wide around certain graves. They rebuilt their fences without asking how they had come to fall. Shadow lingered. It wasn't until 1701, nearly 2 decades after the executions, that the Massachusetts government passed a bill formally reversing the convictions of some, not all, of those who had been tried and executed. Small financial compensation was offered to a few families. The word innocent was used, but sparingly. Even in legal documents, the state seemed to flink. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and others were finally cleared, but names like Bridget Bishop, Giles Corey, and Sarah Good were left untouched. Their descendants would spend decades petitioning for recognition. For some, that recognition wouldn't come until the 20th century. Yes, you read that correctly. It wasn't until 1957, 265 years after the hangings, that the last of the remaining innocent were formally exonerated by the state of Massachusetts. 265 years, and even then the official language was subdued, almost reluctant, because the truth was too sharp, too shameful, too heavy. How do you explain that a court once believed a child's nightmare more than a woman's prayer, that dreams were accepted as testimony, but pleas for mercy were dismissed as cunning? How do you account for a justice system that hang people for crimes that could not be proven, seen, or explained? You repent in quiet. Corners you let weeds grow over thegalaos, and in time people forget or try to, but Salem never really forget, not entirely, because Gallows Hill, though unmarked for centuries, never stopped whispering. The names may have faded from ledgers, but they remained in the soil, in the church pews, in the bones of the town itself. And justice, real justice, the kind that listens, the kind that waits, the kind that forgives, never walked in those courtrooms. Notice it's easy to look back and shake our heads to call the Salem Witch Trials a tragedy, a mistake, a cautionary tale, but doing so requires a kind of distance, one that feels safe, one that makes it seem as though the people of 1692 were somehow not like us, as though we have evolved past hysteria, past fear, past the need to turn on each other when the world stops making sense. But that comfort is an illusion. To truly understand Salem, you have to stand inside the storm. You have to feel what it meant to live in a place where death came not with plague or blade, but with accusation, where the air itself seemed to carry whispers, where every wrong look, every misstep, every night you couldn't sleep might be seen as a sign. So why did it happen? Did a town filled with churchgoers, parents, farmers, and judges unravel into chows? The answers, like the trials themselves, are complex, but we can trace in threads. The Puritans of Massachusetts were not a relaxed people. Their theology was strict, binary, and deeply anxious. They believed the world was a battleground between God and Satan, and that human beings at all times were in danger of falling into darkness. Every crop failure, every stillborn child, every mysterious illness was not just misfortune. It was a message, a test, a punishment. They feared the wilderness that surrounded them. The forest was not just home to wild animals, but to unseen devils. They feared the native tribes they had pushed back violently. They feared the encroaching French Catholics to the north. They feared poverty, famine, war, and most of all they feared disorder. And in the winter of 1692, that fear cracked open. That winter had been one of the coldest in memory. Food was scarce, a disease was spreading, tensions between neighbors had been rising for years, fueled by land disputes, inheritance battles, and church schisms. The town was already divided, already suspicious, already on edge. And then the girls started screaming. No one knew what to make of it. A doctor had examined them and found no natural cause, concluding they were under an evil hand. The theology rushed in to explain what medicine could not. The devil was at work, and if the devil was near, someone had let him in. The question wasn't whether witches existed. That had been settled. The question was who. That's where things spiraled once accusations began. There was no way to stop them. Denial only proved guilt. Silence was seen as cunning, and confession that was twisted into salvation. But only if you named others. It became a game where everyone lost, a machine that fed on fear and grew more powerful with every innocent person it destroyed. But Salem was also a place where grievances festered, old resentments, property disputes, generational rivalries. Once the accusations began, people used them, some consciously, some subconsciously, but their salt was the same. Witchcraft became a language of vengeance. If you wanted to destroy a neighbor, all you had to do was suggest a shadow behind their smile. And if the girls screamed when they walked into the room, well, that was no. And then there was belief, genuine, trembling belief. Not everyone in Salem was lying. Many truly thought they were doing God's work. The afflicted girls may have believed they were tormented. The judges may have believed they were protecting the colony. Even the confessors may have believed that their sins had opened them to Satan's influence. Fear, when weaponized by religion and given a legal system to anchor itself in, becomes faith twisted against itself. And we must not forget the machinery that made it possible. The courts, the laws, the jails, the gallows. This was not a mob with pitchforks. This was government-sanctioned destruction. The accused were examined by magistrates. Their confessions were recorded, their verdicts signed, sealed, and carried out in daylight. The rope around their necks wasn't knotted by neighbors. It was tied by the state. That may be the most haunting truth of all, because it means that Salem didn't burn witches in a moment of madness. It executed them with organization, with order, with procedure. And that's what makes it so familiar. The story of Salem is not just about witches. It's about what happens when certainty replaces compassion, when institutions choose control over conscience, when fear becomes more powerful than truth. It is about what happens when good people remain silent, when the ones who know better say nothing, when those who could stop the madness look away. So yes, Salem was a tragedy, but it wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror, and if we stare into it long enough, we might not just see the faces of Thethed, we might see our own. We've come to the end. Now the trials are over. Thegalau's silent. The courts dissolve, the names mostly cleared, but what lingers is not just the horror of what was done, it's the weight of what it means. The Salem Witch Trials did not happen in the shadows. They happened in daylight, in full view, with sermons and signatures and neighbors watching. They were legal. They were religious, they were socially accepted, and they happened not in some distant barbaric past, but in a literate, God-fearing, politically structured English colony just before the Enlightenment would bloom across Europe. So what do we remember? Remember that 20 people were executed, 19 by hanging, and 1 by pressing. That at least 5 more died in prison. That dozens confessed falsely just to survive. That hundreds were accused. And that countless families were destroyed, reputations stained, lives forever altered. Even for those who walked away free, we remember that the line between belief and hysteria is thinner than we'd like to admit. We remember that fear, when cloaked in virtue, can justify almost anything. We remember how easily occult's voice can become a weapon in the hands of adults who want to believe something terrible is true, how quickly passion becomes proof. How desperately some people will cling to order, even if that order is built on ashes. And we remember the silences, because the truth is most people in Salem said nothing, not the judges, not the pastors, not the townsfolk who heard the rumors, saw the trials, watched the wagons roll past. Even those who doubted kept quiet, because speaking up was dangerous, and dangerous things in Salem ended with a rope. But silence too is a choice. We live with long after the shouting stops. So we remember John Proctor, who condemned the court with his last breath. We remember Rebecca Nurse, who died whispering her innocence. We remember Giles Corey, who said more weight with his chest crushed under stone. We remember Sarah Good, who warned the judges that their blood would one day be drunk by God. We remember Ann Putnam Jr., who came forward 14 years later and admitted what she'd done and asked forgiveness from a town still too ashamed to speak. And we remember the quiet ones, Theons, who confessed to things they never did, the ones who died behind bars, the ones who lived but never healed. We remember them not just because of what happened to them, but because what happened to them is always possible. Again today, we may not hunt witches, but we do hunt enemies. We do divide, we do fear, and sometimes we still believe that justice means punishment first, and truth later. The machinery is different, but the pattern, that part hasn't changed as much as we like to think. So what do we do with the story of Salem? We hold it close to teach it not just as history, but as warning. We speak the names of the dead way, honor the courage of those who stood firm. We recognize the silence of those who didn't, and try to do better, because in the end, the Salem Witch Trials weren't just about witches. They were about people, people who were afraid, people holy, people who died, and people just like us who were asked to choose between what was safe and what was right. Let us not forget them, and let us never ever think it couldn't happen again.